My daughter-in-law tried to put me in assisted living after one minor fall. I heard Camille whisper to my son in the hallway outside my bedroom. I stayed completely still beneath the quilt, my eyes fixed on the soft yellow light bleeding under the door. She can't live alone anymore, Camille continued quietly. What if she falls again when nobody's here? My son didn't answer right away, and somehow, that silence hurt more than her words. I pretended to still be asleep when they walked past my room a few seconds later. But that night, lying there in the dark inside the house my husband and I had built 40 years ago, I realized something terrifying. My fall had never been the real problem. The house was. What happened after that changed the way I looked at my family forever. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know that somewhere out there, someone understands what it feels like to slowly disappear inside your own family. The fall itself had been nothing dramatic. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. It wasn't some terrible accident. I hadn't broken a hip or lost consciousness, or been rushed away in an ambulance with flashing lights. I'd simply slipped on a damp kitchen tile while watering the basil plant near the window above my sink. One moment I was standing there in my wool socks, listening to Frank Sinatra on the little radio beside the toaster. The next, I was on the floor staring up at the ceiling fan, feeling embarrassed more than hurt. I'd bruised my shoulder. That was all. The bruise turned deep purple by evening, but the urgent care doctor assured me nothing was fractured. He recommended rest, ice packs, and avoiding stairs for a few days. At 71, apparently even small falls became concerning events. That phrase followed me home like a storm cloud. Concerning event. Camille repeated it 3 times during dinner that night. You were lucky this time, Lorraine, she said as she spooned roasted potatoes onto Sophie's plate. At your age, one bad fall can change everything. Her tone sounded sweet, concerned, gentle, even, but there was something underneath it, something rehearsed. I noticed the glance she exchanged with Grant across the dinner table. Quick, silent, meaningful, the kind married people develop after years together, the kind that says entire sentences without a single word. I suddenly felt like a stranger sitting at my own dining room table. The dining room still looked exactly the way Franklin had left it before he passed 4 years ago. The dark oak cabinet against the wall. The antique clock beside the archway leading into the kitchen. The cream-colored curtains I'd sewn myself during the winter of 1998 while we watched snowstorms roll across the backyard. But the atmosphere inside the room had changed. The house no longer felt warm. It felt watched. Sophie was the only one who acted normal. My granddaughter sat beside me, quietly eating mashed potatoes, while absent-mindedly drawing tiny flowers onto her napkin with a blue pen. Every once in a while, she glanced at my shoulder, with genuine worry in her eyes. Does it still hurt, Grandma? She asked softly. A little, I admitted with a smile. But I've survived worse things than slippery floors. That earned a tiny laugh from her. Camille didn't laugh. Instead, she folded her hands carefully on the table and sighed. We just need to think realistically now. There it was again. That strange shift in language. Not emotional, not loving, practical, controlled. Grant finally spoke. Camille's just worried about you, Mom. I looked at my son then, really looked at him. At 43, he had more gray hair than Franklin did at 50. The stress around his eyes had deepened over the past few years, though he always insisted work was fine. Lately, he rarely looked directly at me for long, especially when Camille was nearby. I appreciate concern, I said carefully, but I'm not helpless. No one said you were, Camille replied quickly. Too quickly. We just think maybe it's time to discuss safer options. Safer options. I repeated the phrase silently in my mind while my appetite slowly disappeared. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes groaned inside the walls. The familiar sounds of home suddenly felt fragile, as though the entire house already sensed what was coming before I did.
Camille reached for her wine glass.
There's a beautiful assisted living community about 15 minutes from here. My friend's mother lives there and absolutely loves it. The room went completely still. Even Sophie stopped drawing. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood her. Assisted living? I asked quietly. Camille smiled the way customer service employees smile when delivering nudes politely. Just as an option. Grant stared down at his plate. That was the moment something cold settled into my stomach. Not fear exactly, recognition. Because suddenly, little things from the past 6 months started arranging themselves differently inside my head. Like puzzle pieces, finally locking together. Camille insisting I should stop driving at night after I missed a highway exit once. Grant offering to help organize my financial paperwork. The way Camille had started referring to the upstairs guest room as the future nursery, despite never asking how I felt about it. The hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. And now this, assisted living. After one small fall, I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. I'm not leaving my home. Camille immediately softened her expression. Lorraine, nobody's forcing anything. But again, her eyes betrayed her. There was anticipation there, expectation, as though this conversation had already happened in her mind 100 times, and my role was simply to cooperate. Sophie suddenly pushed back her chair. "Grandma's fine," she said quietly. "She just slipped." Camille's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Sweetheart, adults are talking." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel, because they were calculated. Everything about Camille was calculated, even kindness, especially kindness. Dinner ended shortly afterward. Grant carried dishes into the kitchen, while Camille wiped down the counters with sharp, efficient movements. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and cinnamon toast drifting upstairs from the kitchen. For one peaceful moment, lying beneath my quilt with the pale Connecticut sunlight filtering through the curtains, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the entire conversation from the night before. Maybe Camille had only been overreacting. Maybe Grant really was just worried about me. People say foolish things when they're scared. That's what I told myself as I slowly sat up in bed, careful not to aggravate the bruise on my shoulder. The ache had faded overnight into a dull soreness. Nothing more. I'd had worse injuries gardening. Still, when I stood up, I noticed something immediately. My bedroom door was halfway open. I always closed it before sleeping. Always. A small thing. Innocent. Probably. But lately, the small things had started piling up in ways that made my stomach uneasy. I slipped on my robe and headed downstairs. The old staircase creaked beneath my feet the same way it had for decades. Franklin used to joke that the house talked back whenever someone walked through it. Now the sounds just reminded me how old the place had become, and maybe how old everyone suddenly thought I was too. Camille stood in the kitchen wearing cream-colored yoga clothes, her dark hair tied into a polished ponytail. She looked freshly rested, perfectly composed, like one of those women from expensive skincare commercials. "Good morning," she said brightly. "How's the shoulder?" "Better." "That's good." She handed me a mug. "I made your coffee decaf today. Too much caffeine can increase fall risk in older adults." There it was again. Older adults. Not Lorraine, not family. A category, a problem to manage. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway. "Thank you." Grant sat at the kitchen island scrolling through emails on his phone. He barely looked up. "Morning, Mom. Morning." The silence stretched awkwardly, while Camille wiped already clean countertops with a paper towel. She'd been doing that a lot lately. cleaning things that weren't dirty, rearranging cabinets nobody asked her to touch, organizing drawers inside a house that wasn't hers. I suddenly noticed something else missing: the small woven rug beside the sink. "The rug's gone," I said. Camille nodded immediately. It was a tripping hazard. I stared at the empty floorboards for a second longer than necessary. That rug had been there almost 20 years. Franklin bought it during a fall festival in Vermont because he said the faded blue pattern matched my eyes. Now it had disappeared overnight without anyone asking me. A strange heaviness settled quietly inside my chest. Sophie shuffled into the kitchen, wearing oversized pajama pants and carrying a math textbook against her chest. Unlike her parents, she actually looked happy to see me. "Grandma, I saved you the blueberry muffin." She slid the plate toward me before Camille could answer for me. "Thanks, sweetheart." Camille gave Sophie a quick look I couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, more irritation. Like kindness disrupted something carefully organized in her mind. Grant finally cleared his throat. "Mom, Camille found a physical therapist nearby who specializes in senior mobility."
Senior mobility, another phrase.
Another little label. "I don't need physical therapy," I replied calmly. "It could help prevent future accidents," Camille said gently. "At your age, recovery becomes harder." I looked down at my coffee. "At your age," she said it constantly now, wrapped inside concern, hidden inside politeness. But repetition changes things. A phrase stops sounding caring after the 10th time. It starts sounding like preparation. "I'm 71, I said quietly, "not 95. Grant let out a tired sigh. "Nobody's attacking you, Mom." I didn't say they were, but the room already felt defensive. That was the disturbing part. I hadn't raised my voice once, yet somehow every conversation now carried the tension of an argument waiting to happen. Camille suddenly brightened. "Oh, I almost forgot." She reached into her purse and pulled out a glossy brochure. Then she placed it directly beside my coffee cup. "Sunnybrook, Assisted Living and Wellness Community." The photo on the front showed silver-haired seniors smiling beside a fountain, under impossibly blue skies. Everyone looked aggressively cheerful. I felt my pulse slow in that strange way it does, right before shock fully settles in. "Camille?" Grant muttered quietly. "What?" she said innocently. "It's just information." I opened the brochure slowly. Private suites, medication assistance, social enrichment activities, transportation services. The words blurred together after a while. I could barely hear the rain outside anymore. "I'm not moving into a facility," I said carefully. Camille sat beside Grant at the island. "Lorraine, please don't think of it negatively. These communities are beautiful now. People your age thrive there. People your age. Not people, not mothers, not women who spent 40 years building homes and families and traditions. Just aging bodies requiring supervision." Sophie looked visibly uncomfortable. She stared down at her cereal bowl without speaking. Finally, she whispered, "Grandma likes living here." Camille's jaw tightened briefly before the smile returned. "Of course she does. But sometimes what we want and what's safest aren't the same thing." Safest. Another word they kept using. As though safety outweighed dignity. As though surviving long enough somehow mattered more than actually living. I closed the brochure and slid it gently across the counter. "I appreciate your concern," I said softly. "But this conversation is over." Camille didn't argue. That frightened me more than if she had. She simply nodded once, calm and composed, like someone confident time was already on her side. Then she picked up the brochure and tucked it neatly back into her purse. As if she knew she'd be needing it again soon. That afternoon, the house felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful quiet. Careful quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like conversations are happening somewhere just beyond your hearing. Grant had gone back to work after lunch, kissing Camille on the cheek before leaving through the garage. Sophie was upstairs doing homework with music, playing softly behind her bedroom door. And Camille spent most of the afternoon moving through the house, with restless energy, opening closets, organizing shelves, wiping surfaces that were already spotless. Every few minutes, I heard cabinet doors closing, drawers sliding shut, the soft hum of her voice on the phone. I sat in the sunroom, pretending to read one of my gardening magazines, while rain clouds drifted slowly across the backyard. The roses along the fence had begun blooming early this year. Franklin always loved June roses. He used to cut one bloom every morning and leave it beside my coffee cup. Funny how grief changes over time. At first, losing someone feels loud. Then eventually it becomes quiet. A silence that follows you everywhere. Around 3 o'clock, I realized Camille had gone unusually still. No cabinets, no footsteps, no vacuum cleaner humming upstairs. Just silence. Then I heard her voice from the hallway near Grant's office. Low, focused, careful. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. At least, not at first. But when people start discussing your future like you're not in the room anymore, it becomes difficult not to listen. I set my magazine down quietly and moved toward the hallway, my slippers barely making sound against the hardwood floor. Grant's office door was mostly closed. Camille stood inside near the window with her back toward me, speaking softly into her phone. "Yes, but the house itself is in excellent condition," she said. "The kitchen was remodeled about 8 years ago." A pause. "No, she's still living here for now." For now, I felt something tighten in my chest. Camille lowered her voice further. "Honestly, once the transition happens, I don't think we'll need to do much before listing it. The words landed slowly, coldly. Not hypothetically. Not someday, like a plan already unfolding. I should have walked away then. A dignified woman would have. But dignity becomes complicated when people begin discussing your life like an inconvenient lease agreement. "She had another incident last week," Camille continued smoothly. "Minor fall. But at her age, these things escalate quickly." Another pause, then she laughed softly. "Oh, trust me. Grant's almost there. Almost where?" The hallway suddenly felt too narrow. Too warm. I stepped backward before the floorboards could creak beneath me, and quietly returned to the sunroom, my hands trembling despite myself. For several minutes, I simply stared out at the yard without seeing any of it clearly. The bird feeder Franklin, built near the maple tree, the stone path leading toward the garden. The old swing Sophie used to love when she was little. Everything blurred together behind one horrible realization. They weren't just talking about assisted living anymore. They were talking about my house after I was gone from it. And somehow that hurt even more. Not because of the property itself, because of what it represented. 40 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, family dinners, late-night talks with Franklin at the kitchen table, while the rest of the house slept upstairs. This wasn't real estate to me. It was my life. A little after 5, Sophie wandered into the sunroom, carrying her phone charger wrapped around her hand. "Grandma?" she asked carefully. "Are you okay?" I forced a small smile. "Of course." She didn't look convinced. Children notice more than adults realize, especially quiet children. Sophie sat beside me on the couch and tucked one leg underneath herself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped gently against the windows, while thunder rumbled somewhere far away. Then she said something that made my stomach sink. "Mom's been looking at houses online a lot lately." I turned slowly toward her. "Has she?" Sophie nodded absent-mindedly. "Big ones," she said. "If you moved somewhere with medical staff, we could finally have enough room for a pool." The words weren't cruel coming from Sophie, just honest. Children repeat truths adults accidentally reveal around them. I kept my expression calm somehow. Did your mother say where I'd be moving? Sophie hesitated. Then she looked down at her hands. She said assisted living communities are safer for elderly people. Elderly people. I almost smiled at that. Amazing how quickly the world starts speaking about you differently once you pass 70. Not experienced, not wise. Elderly, fragile, temporary. Sophie suddenly looked worried. Grandma, you're not sick, right? No, sweetheart. I touched her hand gently. I'm not sick. She relaxed slightly. Good. Because I don't want you to leave. That nearly broke me. Not Camille's manipulation. Not Grant's silence. That. One honest sentence from a 14-year-old girl. I looked toward the kitchen, where I could hear Camille opening drawers again. Moving confidently through my house, like someone already redesigning it in her head. And for the first time since my fall, fear gave way to something else. Attention. Real attention. Because suddenly every strange comment from the past year sounded different in my memory. Every polite suggestion, every helpful conversation, every question about finances, maintenance, insurance, and property taxes. This hadn't started after my fall. The fall had simply given them permission to move faster. That night, after everyone went upstairs, I stayed awake at the dining room table long after midnight, with a cup of cold tea beside me. The house creaked softly around me. The next morning, I found Franklin's old toolbox sitting open in the garage. I hadn't touched it in years. The metal edges were rusted now, and the faded red paint had chipped away near the handle. But the sight of it stopped me cold anyway. For a moment, I could almost picture him standing there again in his flannel jacket, muttering under his breath, while fixing something around the house. The man could repair almost anything except his own heart. I stood quietly beside the workbench, running my fingers across the cool metal lid while memories drifted through me slowly. Like dust floating through sunlight, Franklin built most of this house himself. Not literally, from the ground up, of course, but every room carried his fingerprints somehow. The shelves in the study, the crown molding in the dining room, the little reading nook beside the upstairs window that he surprised me with one winter after I mentioned wanting a quiet place to read during snowstorms. This house wasn't expensive when we bought it back in 1983. Ugly, actually. The wallpaper looked like something from a roadside motel, and the kitchen linoleum peeled at the corners. But Franklin walked through those empty rooms with this impossible confidence, already imagining what the place could become. We'll grow old here, he told me that first day. At the time, growing old sounded romantic, not frightening. I leaned against the workbench carefully, still favoring my bruised shoulder. Outside, the sky hung gray and heavy over the backyard. Sophie had already left for school, and Grant was at work again. Camille had gone grocery shopping about an hour earlier. Though lately, even her errands made me uneasy. Everything felt strategic now. Every movement, every conversation, every smile. I opened one of the toolbox drawers absent-mindedly and found Franklin's old measuring tape still inside. Yellow, scratched, worn smooth from decades of use. I picked it up slowly, and suddenly I remembered the night Grant turned 16. Franklin stayed up until almost midnight, helping him build a desk for his bedroom because Grant wanted something solid for studying. The two of them worked side by side in this very garage while I carried out sandwiches and lemonade. Grant adored his father back then, followed him everywhere, wanted his advice about everything from shaving cream to college applications. And Franklin, Franklin loved that boy with his whole heart. That's what made all of this hurt so deeply now. Not just Camille's behavior, Grant's silence. Because silence from your own child feels different than cruelty from a stranger. It said somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to reach. I carried the measuring tape back inside and found myself wandering slowly through the living room. The house felt strangely hollow during daylight now, as if the walls themselves were listening. My eyes drifted toward the fireplace mantel. Photos lined the shelf in silver frames. Grant at 8 years old, holding a fishing rod beside Franklin at Lake George. Sophie as a toddler covered in birthday cake, frosting. One picture from our 30th wedding anniversary, where Franklin had his arm wrapped around my shoulders while I laughed at something. He whispered into my ear. I stared at that photo the longest. Franklin always noticed things before I did. People's motives, lies, hidden resentment, especially when it came to Camille. At first, he tried very hard to like her for Grant's sake. He admired her ambition, her confidence, the way she could walk into any room and instantly take control of it. But over time,
little comments started slipping through.
quiet observations he'd make while loading the dishwasher or locking up the house at night. She's always measuring people, he once told me. I remember laughing at the phrase. What does that even mean? Franklin shrugged. Some people walk into a room looking for connection. Camille walks into a room looking for leverage. At the time, I thought he was being overly suspicious. Now I wasn't so sure. Another memory surfaced suddenly. About a year before Franklin died, Camille spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner talking about smart downsizing for retirees. She kept bringing up maintenance costs, property taxes, staircases, and fall risks while carving turkey like she was hosting a seminar instead of a holiday meal. Franklin barely touched his food that night. Later, after everyone left, he stood at the kitchen sink rinsing dishes while rain hit the windows outside. She talks about this house like she's already planning its future, he said quietly. I remember defending her. She's practical, that's all. Franklin dried his hands slowly and looked at me in that calm way he always did when he already knew something I didn't. Promise me something, Lorraine. What? If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone pressure you out of this house before you're ready. At the time, the conversation felt unnecessary, almost silly. Franklin had only been 67 then, strong, healthy-looking, still mowing the lawn himself every Saturday morning. Neither of us imagined he'd be gone less than a year later. A sharp ache spread quietly through my chest. Grief is strange that way. Sometimes it waits patiently for years before returning all at once over the smallest thing. A sentence. A smell. An old measuring tape inside a garage drawer. I sat down slowly in Franklin's chair near the window and looked around the living room again. At the bookshelves, we painted together. At the piano Sophie used during middle school recitals. At the staircase Camille now walked up and down like a woman's, inspecting property she intended to. 2 days later, Judith Hale showed up at my front door, carrying a blueberry pie. And the kind of expression people wear when they already know something is wrong, before you say a word. Judith and I had been friends for almost 30 years. We met volunteering at the public library when Sophie's father was still in middle school, and my hair was still mostly brown instead of silver. She was one of those women who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Sharp eyes, sharp tongue, sharp instincts. Franklin used to joke that Judith could uncover government secrets just by attending a church potluck. When I opened the door, her eyes immediately drifted toward the fading bruise near my shoulder. Oh, Lorraine, she sighed softly. You really did fall. I slipped, I corrected. The way people have been slipping since kitchens were invented. That earned the smallest smile from her, but it disappeared quickly. Can I come in? Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. I stepped aside and let her enter. Camille wasn't home yet. She had taken Sophie shopping for summer clothes, and Grant wouldn't return from work until evening. The house felt unusually calm without them there, almost like it could finally breathe for a few hours. Judith followed me into the kitchen while I made tea. She moved slowly around the room, studying things without appearing to study them. The missing rug beside the sink. The stack of assisted living brochures, partially hidden beneath Camille's mail near the fruit bowl. The new medication organizers sitting beside the refrigerator. None of it escaped her attention. "You've got that look," I said quietly while filling the kettle. "What look?" "The one you get right before telling me something unpleasant." Judith leaned against the counter and folded her arms. "How serious is Camille about moving you out of here?" The question landed heavily between us. I tried to laugh it off, apparently serious enough to leave brochures around the kitchen. Judith didn't laugh. Instead, she looked toward the dining room to make sure we were alone before lowering her voice. "Lorraine, I need you to listen carefully to me." My hands stilled around the teacups. "Last Thursday," she continued, "I saw Camille at Harbor Ridge Realty." I frowned slightly. "She's a realtor, yes, but she wasn't there for works." Judith paused. "She was meeting with an estate consultant." A cold sensation spread slowly through my chest. "What kind of consultant?" "The kind people hire when they're preparing inherited property for sale." The kettle started whistling softly behind me, but neither of us moved right away. I stared at Judith while the room suddenly felt much smaller than before. "She doesn't own this house," I said carefully. "No," Judith replied. "But I think she's planning for the day she believes she will." I finally turned off the stove with slightly trembling hands. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft ticking of the clock above the pantry door. Tick, tick, tick. The sound reminded me of hospital waiting rooms. Judith sat at the kitchen table while I poured tea neither of us really wanted. "I wasn't going to say anything," she admitted quietly. "But then I heard about your fall from Margaret Lewis at church. And Lorraine?" She hesitated. "The timing bothers me." I slowly sat across from her. "What are you saying?" Judith wrapped both hands around her teacup. "I think Camille's been waiting for a reason." The sentence settled into me with horrifying clarity, because deep down, I already knew she was right. Not waiting for me to get hurt, waiting for proof. Proof that could justify removing me from my own life while still appearing compassionate to everyone else. "She keeps using words like safety," I whispered. "And concern and support." "That's how people control situations now," Judith said bluntly. "Nobody says cruel things directly anymore. They disguise everything as help." I looked down at the steam rising from my tea. The terrible part was how believable it all sounded from the outside. A 71-year-old widow falls in her kitchen. Her son and daughter-in-law become concerned about her living alone. They encourage safer housing with medical staff nearby. Reasonable, responsible, loving even. That's what made it so dangerous. Because manipulation wrapped in kindness is harder to fight than open cruelty. Judith leaned closer across the table. "Has anyone asked you to sign paperwork yet?" I blinked. "No." "Good." The word came out fast enough to alarm me. "Judith," she sighed and rubbed her forehead. "Lorraine, I spent 22 years working in legal offices. I've seen families do ugly things once property gets involved." "This is Grant," I said quietly, though even to my own ears, I sounded uncertain now. "Yes," Judith replied gently, "and that's exactly why you're vulnerable." The honesty in her voice nearly broke me. I looked toward the living room, where Franklin's chair still sat beside the window, exactly the way he left it. For years after his death, I believed loneliness would be the hardest part of widowhood. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how quickly some people begin repositioning themselves around whatever remains after the grieving ends. Judith reached into her purse and slid a business card across the table toward me. "Howard Mercer, attorney at law." I recognized the name instantly. Howard had handled Franklin's business paperwork years ago. Quiet man, careful, precise. Franklin trusted him deeply. You need to talk to him, Judith said softly. Soon. I stared at the card for several seconds without touching it. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the darkening sky while headlights swept briefly across the front windows. Camille and Sophie returning home. Judith stood immediately. Don't tell them we had this conversation. Fear flickered inside me again. Do you really think it's that serious? Judith looked directly into my eyes then. And what frightened me most was that she didn't hesitate. Yes, she said quietly. I do. That evening, I did something I'm not proud of. I pretended to be weaker than I really was. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone to accuse me of lying. Just small things. Careful things. I held the stair railing a little longer while walking upstairs. I moved slower through the kitchen. Once, while reaching for a coffee mug, I deliberately paused as though I'd briefly forgotten where I was putting it. And Camille noticed every single detail. That's how I knew Judith was right. People who genuinely love you don't monitor your weaknesses that closely. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Camille already sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open beside a cup of herbal tea. She looked unusually energized for 8 in the morning. Good morning, she said pleasantly. How did you sleep? Oh! All right, I suppose. I rubbed my temple lightly. I woke up confused for a second around 3. Camille's eyes sharpened instantly, only for half a second. But I saw it. Interest, not concern. Interest. That can happen after falls, she said carefully, especially with head trauma. I didn't hit my head. Still. She tilted her head sympathetically. At our age, even minor accidents can affect cognitive clarity. Our age. Camille was 39. The woman spoke about aging the way meteorologists discuss incoming storms. Grant walked into the kitchen, adjusting his tie while checking something on his phone. Morning. Your mother woke up disoriented last night, Camille said immediately. I almost admired how naturally the lie left her mouth. Not technically a lie, perhaps. Just edited, reshaped into something more useful. Grant looked at me with immediate concern. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine, but I added a tiny hesitation before the word. Barely noticeable. Camille definitely noticed. I could practically see her mind organizing information behind her eyes. Collecting evidence. Building a case. Sophie entered the kitchen a few minutes later wearing headphones around her neck and carrying a banana. She glanced between all of us with the weary expression teenagers develop when adults have been acting strange for too long. What happened now? She asked. Nothing, I said quickly. Camille gave me a soft smile. Grandma just had a little confusion last night. Sophie frowned immediately. Grandma remembers literally everything. I nearly smiled into my coffee. Children really do tell the truth when nobody trains them not to. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly. But I started paying closer attention to Camille. Truly paying attention. And once I did, certain patterns became impossible to ignore. She made phone calls whenever she thought I couldn't hear her. She started speaking to Grant in lowered voices more frequently. Twice that afternoon, I caught her taking photos around the house with her phone, the kitchen, the upstairs hallway, the backyard garden. At first, I told myself there could be innocent explanations. Camille worked in real estate. Maybe photographing houses had become second nature to her. But deep down, I already knew better. Especially after what happened later that evening. I had gone upstairs early with a book, though I wasn't really reading. Around 9:30, I realized I'd left my reading glasses downstairs in the living room. As I walked carefully down the staircase, voices drifted from the kitchen. Camille and Grant, arguing softly. We can't just wait forever, Camille whispered sharply. She's my mother, And I'm trying to think long term. Grant. I stopped halfway down the stairs, my hand tightening around the railing. She's independent, Grant continued quietly. Maybe we're overreacting. Camille let out a frustrated sigh. Independent people don't fall alone in kitchens. It was one fall. One fall becomes three. Then a broken hip. Then an emergency. Her voice softened strategically. I'm trying to protect all of us. There it was again. Protect. Safety. Concern. The language never changed, only the pressure beneath it. I remained perfectly still, while Camille continued speaking. And honestly, the house is too much for her now. The words landed harder than the rest somehow. Not because they were loud, because they were calm, certain, as if my future had already been decided privately without me. Grant sounded exhausted. I just don't want her thinking we're trying to push her out. Camille lowered her voice even further then, but the house was old and carried sound easily through the vents. She won't have a choice eventually. Heavy silence. The kind that changes something permanently once you hear it. I slowly turned around before they could discover me there, and climbed back upstairs as quietly as possible. My chest felt tight by the time I reached my bedroom. Not panic. Something colder. Clarity. Because finally, after days of doubt and confusion, one truth became impossible to deny. Camille wasn't simply worried about me growing older. She was planning around it. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a very long time, listening to the muffled sounds of their voices downstairs. Then my eyes drifted toward Franklin's old cedar chest near the window. Inside it were decades of paperwork. Insurance documents, tax files, property records, trust information. Franklin insisted on organizing personally before he died. At the time, I barely paid attention when he explained everything. Just in case, he used to say. Back then, I thought he meant accidents, illness, unexpected death. Now, sitting alone in the dark while my son and daughter-in-law quietly discussed my future downstairs, I began to wonder if Franklin had feared something else entirely. Not strangers, family. The next morning, I waited until the house was empty before opening Franklin's cedar chest. Grant had left for work before sunrise for some kind of budget meeting downtown. And Camille drove Sophie to school around 8:30. I watched their SUV disappear down the street through the lace curtains in the living room before finally locking the front door behind them. For the first time in days, the house felt still. Not tense, not observed, just still. I carried the cedar chest key in the back of my jewelry drawer, beneath an old velvet pouch of costume earrings I never wore anymore. Franklin always teased me about hiding important things in places only I would think to look. Burglars understand safes, he used to say. They don't understand old women. At the time, I laughed. Now the memory made my throat tighten. The cedar chest sat near the window in my bedroom, exactly where Franklin left it. The brass lock clicked softly beneath my fingers as I opened it. A faint scent of cedar and old paper drifted upward immediately, carrying decades of memories with it. Inside were neatly organized folders, tied with faded blue ribbon. Tax returns, property records, insurance policies, bank statements. Franklin labeled everything in careful block handwriting. He trusted order, documentation, preparation. I knelt carefully beside the chest, ignoring the ache in my shoulder, and started sorting through the files one by one. Outside, wind rustled softly through the maple trees, while sunlight crept slowly across the bedroom carpet. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. Then, I noticed something strange. A folder labeled Property and Trust Documents looked thinner than I remembered. At first, I thought maybe age was making me paranoid. But when I opened it, several papers were clearly missing. My stomach dropped instantly. I emptied the entire folder onto the bed. Insurance declarations, old mortgage records, utility documentation, but not the trust paperwork. Franklin reviewed with Howard Mercer shortly before his death. Gone. I sat frozen for several seconds, staring at the empty spaces where the documents should have been. Then, another realization hit me even harder. Someone had gone through this chest recently. Franklin always stacked papers with exact precision. Everything aligned perfectly. Now, several folders sat crooked, disturbed slightly, like someone tried to reorganize them afterward, but didn't understand his system well enough to make it look natural. A cold wave of anger spread quietly through me. Not loud anger, the dangerous kind. The kind that arrives after fear finally burns away. I immediately checked the smaller envelope where Franklin kept spare keys and personal notes. Still there. Thank God. But beneath this envelope sat something else I'd never seen before. A yellow sticky note in Camille's handwriting. Ask Howard about transfer procedure. My hands went completely still. There was no date, no explanation. Just those 5 words written in neat blue ink. Ask Howard about transfer procedure. I stared at the note while my heartbeat thudded slowly inside my ears. Transfer, not protection, not care. Transfer. Like ownership, like transition, like replacing me inside my own life. I suddenly remembered Camille offering to help organize paperwork after Franklin died. At the time, I appreciated it. Grief made simple tasks feel impossible back then. Bills, insurance calls, bank appointments. I barely remember half of that first year after losing him. And now I wondered how much access I'd unknowingly given her, while I was too heartbroken to think clearly. I carefully returned everything exactly the way I found it before closing the chest again. My movements felt strangely calm now, focused. Because once someone crosses a certain line, confusion disappears. The situation becomes simple. Either you protect yourself, or you wait quietly to be erased. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 11 times. I went into the kitchen and made tea with slightly trembling hands, then carried the mug into Franklin's study. The room still smelled faintly of leather and old books. His reading glasses remained inside the top desk drawer, exactly where he left them 4 years ago. For a moment, grief hit me so hard I had to close my eyes. Not because Franklin was gone, because suddenly I understood how alone he must have felt near the end, when he realized what Camille truly was. He tried to warn me gently, and I hadn't listened. A sound outside pulled me from my thoughts. Car doors. Voices. Camille was home earlier than expected. I quickly set my tea down just as the front door opened downstairs. Shopping bags rustled. Cabinet doors opened. Then, footsteps moved through the kitchen. A minute later, Camille appeared in the study doorway, holding grocery bags against her hip. "Oh," she said lightly. "There you are." For one brief second, her eyes drifted toward the cedar chest key, still sitting beside me on the desk. And something flickered across her face too quickly for most people to notice. Recognition.
Recognition. Then
I called Howard Mercer the following morning while Camille was in the backyard, pretending to trim roses she'd never cared about before. I stood in the pantry with the door half closed, gripping the cordless phone tighter than necessary, while my heartbeat thudded steadily beneath my ribs. Howard answered on the 3rd ring. Mercer speaking. For a second, hearing his voice nearly unraveled me. Some people carry familiarity in their tone. Stability. The sound of years when life still made sense. Howard had been Franklin's attorney for almost 2 decades. Quiet man. Careful with words. The kind of person who listened longer than he spoke. "Howard," I said softly. "It's Lorraine Whitaker." A pause. Then warmth entered his voice immediately. "Lorraine, how are you holding up? Not how are you doing.
How are you?
Holding up." As though somewhere deep down, he already understood. This call wasn't really about paperwork. "I need to see you," I admitted quietly. Privately. Another pause. Does this involve the house? He asked. The question chilled me instantly. Yes. Howard didn't hesitate. Come by my office at 2. And Lorraine? Yes? Don't discuss this with anyone beforehand. The line went silent after that. I stood alone in the pantry, staring at shelves full of canned soup and pasta boxes, while unease crawled slowly through me, because Howard's reaction told me something important. Franklin had spoken to him about this before he died. Outside the kitchen window, Camille moved carefully through the garden, holding pruning shears in one manicured hand. She looked peaceful out there among my roses. Domestic, caring. Like the devoted daughter-in-law neighbors probably believed she was. The performance almost impressed me now. Almost. At lunch, I casually mentioned needing to run errands downtown. Camille immediately looked up from her salad. What kind of errands? The question came too quickly, too naturally. I kept my tone light. Just boring paperwork. I can come with you if you want. No need. I smiled softly. I'm still capable of surviving small outings on my own. For half a second, something dark flickered behind her smile. Then it disappeared. Well, she said pleasantly. Just be careful driving. Careful. Everything with her circled back to fragility now. Risk. Decline. Weakness. By 1:30, I was sitting in my Buick outside Howard Mercer's office downtown, with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The building looked exactly the same as it had 10 years ago. Brick exterior. Brass directory sign. Neatly trimmed hedges near the entrance. I suddenly felt absurdly nervous walking inside. As though cross that doorway meant admitting my family truly had become something dangerous. Howard greeted me personally in the reception area. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. Not shock. Recognition, again. That frightened me. He already knew. His office smelled faintly of coffee and old leather-bound books. Rain clouds gathered outside the windows while I sat across from him in a dark green chair. Franklin once joked looked expensive enough to charge rent. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Howard folded his hands carefully atop his desk. Tell me everything. So I did. The fall. The brochures. The whispered conversations. The missing documents inside Franklin's cedar chest. And finally, the sticky note in Camille's handwriting. Ask Howard about transfer procedure. Howard became very still after that. The kind of stillness professionals develop when they're trying not to react emotionally. She accessed the cedar chest? He asked quietly. I think so. Howard leaned back slowly in his chair and removed his glasses. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked genuinely angry. Not loud anger. Controlled anger. Franklin was worried about this, he admitted carefully. The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at my hands. He knew. He suspected Camille viewed the house as an eventual asset rather than a family home. Howard paused, and he worried Grant might become persuadable over time, pursuable. Such a polite word for betrayal. A sharp ache spread through my chest. Howard opened a drawer and removed a thick folder stamped Whitaker Family Trust. Then he slid it across the desk toward me. Lorraine, he said calmly, your husband created an irrevocable trust 11 months before his death. I stared at him. A trust? Howard nodded. The house legally belongs to the trust now, not Grant, not Camille. The room suddenly felt unsteady. She can't sell it, I whispered. No. Relief hit me so fast I nearly cried, but Howard wasn't finished. However, he continued carefully, if someone successfully convinced the court you were mentally incapable of managing your affairs, they could petition for conservatorship authority over your living arrangements. The words settled heavily between us. She's trying to prove I'm incompetent. Howard didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Outside, Thunder rolled softly over downtown Hartford, while rain streaked across the office windows. I suddenly remembered every carefully phrased comment Camille had made since my fall. Confused, unnaif, cognitive clarity, senior mobility, not random concern, documentation, narrative building. She's constructing a picture, I said quietly. Howard nodded once. And if that's true, Lorraine, you need to become very... When I returned home from Howard Mercer's office, the house looked warm and inviting from the outside. The porch light glowed softly against the early evening rain, and through the front windows I could see movement in the kitchen. Shadows crossed back and forth. Dinner being prepared. For years, sights like that made me feel safe. Now they made cautious. I sat in my car for almost a full minute before going inside, my hands resting quietly on the steering wheel, while Howard's words replayed in my mind. She's constructing a picture. The frightening part was how carefully Camille had been doing it. Not through cruelty, through concern. That was what made her dangerous. When I stepped through the front door, the smell of garlic and rosemary drifted from the kitchen. Camille stood at the stove, stirring something in a Dutch oven, while soft jazz played through the speaker near the refrigerator. Everything looked painfully normal. "Oh, good, you're back," Camille said brightly. "I was starting to worry, always worry." "I survived downtown traffic," I replied calmly, as I hung my coat beside the door. "Barely," she laughed politely. Too politely. Grant appeared from the dining room, holding his laptop under one arm. "How'd the errands go?" "Fine." I kept my answers short now. Careful. Howard advised me to speak less around them whenever possible. "Don't volunteer confusion," he'd said quietly before I left his office. "People hear what benefits them." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Sophie wandered downstairs a few minutes later, wearing oversized socks and carrying a sketchbook against her chest. Unlike the adults, her smile when she saw me looked genuine. "Grandma, look what I finished." She opened the sketchbook immediately. It was a charcoal drawing of the backyard garden, the rose bushes, the bird feeder Franklin, built years ago, even the cracked stone path near the fence. My throat tightened unexpectedly. "It's beautiful," I whispered honestly. Camille glanced at the drawing briefly before turning back toward the stove. "Sophie inherited your sentimental streak." The comment sounded harmless enough, but somehow it carried the same quiet dismissal Camille attached to anything emotional, as though love for a home was naive compared to square footage and resale value. Dinner that night felt strangely formal. Camille lit candles, used cloth napkins, even brought out the heavy serving dishes normally reserved for holidays. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining the tension because of everything Howard told me earlier. Then Camille poured wine for herself and Grant before folding her hands neatly on the table. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately," she said softly. There it was. The setup. Grant shifted slightly in his chair without looking at me. Sophie kept eating quietly beside me. Camille continued in that calm, measured tone she always used when she wanted to sound compassionate. "Life changes so quickly as people get older. One accident can completely shift what's realistic." I cut my chicken slowly without responding. "I spoke with a woman this afternoon whose mother moved into assisted living after a staircase fall," Camille added. "And honestly, she's thriving now." Thriving. The brochures used that word too. I suddenly realized Camille repeated phrases the same way advertisers repeat slogans. Deliberately. Constantly. Until resistance sounds unreasonable. Grant cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe this isn't the right time." "No, I think it's important," Camille replied gently. "Avoiding difficult conversations doesn't help anyone." She looked directly at me then. "We just want you safe, Lorraine. Safe." That word again. I finally looked up from my plate. "Do you know something strange about getting older?" I asked quietly. Camille blinked slightly. "What?" "People stop asking what makes you happy. The room felt silent. Even the jazz music from the kitchen suddenly sounded too loud. I continued carefully. They only ask what keeps you alive longer. Grant rubbed a hand across his forehead. Sophie stared down at her plate. Camille's smile tightened faintly. This isn't about happiness versus safety. Isn't it? My voice stayed calm. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while candlelight flickered across the dining room. Walls. Franklin painted himself almost 20 years ago. Then Sophie said something unexpected. Grandma shouldn't have to leave just because she slipped once. Camille immediately shifted into patient mother mode. Sweetheart, nobody's forcing Grandma to do anything. But she said it while avoiding my eyes. That mattered. Because people usually look directly at you when they're telling the truth. Grant finally sighed. Can we please not turn dinner into a fight? Fight. Interesting word. I hadn't raised my voice once. Neither had Camille. Yet somehow, disagreement itself had to become framed as conflict. Another subtle shift. Another quiet way to make resistance unstable. I suddenly understood something Howard meant earlier. Narratives don't form all at once. They form slowly. One careful sentence at a time. After dinner, Camille insisted on cleaning everything herself. Another recent habit. She liked controlling spaces now. Kitchens, closets, medicine cabinets. I excused myself early and went upstairs. But halfway down the hallway, I realized I'd forgotten my phone on the dining room table. As I turned back toward the staircase, voices drifted upward from below. Camille speaking softly. If we wait too long, it gets messier legally. My entire body went still. Grant answered too quietly for me to hear clearly. Then Camille again. She's already becoming forgetful. Howard will see that eventually, too. Forgetful. I gripped the hallway railing so tightly my knuckles hurt. Because suddenly, everything became terrifyingly clear. Camille wasn't just planning my future anymore. She was preparing to redefine my reality itself. And downstairs, my son wasn't stopping. The following afternoon, Camille suggested hosting a small family dinner. The phrase alone made me suspicious now. Nothing in this house felt small anymore. Every conversation carried weight beneath it. Every smile concealed measurement. Still, I agreed, because Howard's final words before I left his office kept echoing in my mind. Let them underestimate how much you understand. By 6 o'clock, the dining room looked almost elegant again. Camille had roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, lit candles along the center of the table, and even placed fresh flowers near the window. To anyone looking from outside, we probably resembled one of those magazine families people envy quietly. Successful son, beautiful daughter-in-law, granddaughter doing homework nearby, elderly widow lovingly cared for in her final years. The performance was almost perfect. Almost. Judith out after 6:30 carrying a bottle of wine and enough skepticism to fill the entire room by herself. Camille invited her earlier that morning, which surprised me. But then I realized why. Witnesses. Camille liked witnesses. People who could later describe how concerned and supportive she'd been. Lorraine. Judith greeted warmly as she hugged me. You look stronger already. Camille's smile flickered slightly at the word stronger. I noticed. Judith noticed too. Dinner began politely enough. Sophie talked about summer art classes while Grant discussed rising mortgage rates and office layoffs. Camille floated around the table, refilling water glasses and smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth. Like a woman auditioning for sainthood. Then, halfway through dinner, she finally did what she'd been building toward for weeks. She set down her wine glass carefully and sighed. I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Lorraine's fall. The room immediately changed temperature. Grant stared down at his plate. Judith became very still beside me. Sophie stopped eating altogether. Camille folded her hands gently together. I know these conversations are uncomfortable, but avoiding reality doesn't help anyone. Reality. Another carefully chosen word. She turned to Judith with the calm expression of someone already certain. She sounded reasonable. You know how quickly things can decline at this age. Judith didn't answer. Camille continued anyway. We're starting to worry Lorraine may not be safe living independently anymore. There it was. Out loud now. Publicly. Not suggestion. Narrative. I noticed Sophie's eyes immediately dart toward me. Nervous. Protective. Grant cleared his throat softly. Camille? No, she interrupted gently. Someone has to be honest. Honest. Funny word coming from her. She's becoming forgetful. Camille continued carefully, disoriented at times, and after the fall. She paused with practiced sadness. I'm afraid things are progressing faster than we wanted to admit. Progressing. As though I were some inevitable condition instead of a living person sitting directly across from her. I reached for my water glass slowly, mostly to steady my hands. Judith suddenly spoke. Lorraine remembered the exact date of your anniversary dinner from 11 years ago yesterday. Camille smiled politely. Early memory retention often remains intact. I almost admired how quickly she adapted. Grant looked deeply uncomfortable now. He kept adjusting his napkin and avoiding everyone's eyes like a man trapped between guilt and cowardice. Then Camille delivered the line she'd probably rehearsed a dozen times in her head. We've started researching assisted living communities. Silence crashed across the table. Even the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded louder. Sophie looked horrified. Mom. What? Camille replied calmly. I'm trying to do what's best for Grandma. Best for Grandma. Not what Grandma wanted. What they decided was best. That distinction mattered more than anyone there realized. I finally looked directly at my son. Grant. He hesitated before meeting my eyes. And in that moment, I saw it clearly for the first time. Shame. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Shame. Because somewhere deep down, he knew exactly what was happening. Mom, he began quietly. Nobody's trying to hurt you. There it was again. Nobody's hurting you. As if pain only counted when someone raised their voice, I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. You know, I said softly. Your father used to say something interesting. Nobody interrupted. He believed people reveal themselves most clearly when money and property enter. A conversation. Camille's expression changed, almost invisibly, just for a second, but it was enough. Judith leaned back slightly in her chair, watching Camille with open dislike now. Sophie looked confused. Grant looked exhausted. Camille recovered quickly. This has nothing to do with the house. The lie landed heavily in the room. Because suddenly nobody fully believed her anymore. Not even Grant. I looked toward the hallway, where Franklin's old coat still hung beside the front closet. For one strange second, I could almost hear his voice again. Calm. Certain. Warning me gently the way he used to. Don't let anyone pressure you out before you're ready. I turned back toward Camille, and for the first time since all of this started, I stopped feeling afraid of her. Because Howard had given me something she didn't know existed yet. Protection. Real protection. Camille leaned forward slightly. Lorraine, we only want what's safest for you. I held her gaze calmly. No, I said quietly. I think you want what's safest for your plans. The room went completely silent. Camille froze. Grant looked up sharply. Sophie's eyes widened. Judith nearly smiled into her wine glass. For the first time, nobody spoke for several seconds after my comment. The silence spread slowly across the dining room, like smoke after a fire. Camille sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her wine glass suspended lightly between her fingers. Grant stared down at his plate again, but this time it wasn't avoidance alone. It was panic. Because for the first time since my fall, The script had shifted away from them. Judith finally broke the silence with a soft sip of wine. "Well," she said dryly, "that certainly clarified the mood." Sophie almost smiled before quickly lowering her eyes. Camille recovered first, of course. Women like her always do. She placed her glass down carefully and folded her hands together with practiced calm. "I understand you're upset." "No," I interrupted quietly. "You understand I'm paying attention now." That landed harder than shouting ever could have. I saw it immediately in Camille's face. Not guilt, calculation. Her mind adjusting in real time, rethinking strategy, measuring risk. Grant rubbed both hands over his face. "Can we please stop turning this into something ugly?" Ugly. Interesting choice of word. As though the problem wasn't what had been happening behind closed doors, but the fact someone finally said it aloud. I looked at my son for a long moment. "You know what hurts the most?" I asked softly. Grant finally met my eyes. Not her. I nodded slightly toward Camille. "You." His expression shifted instantly. Shame again. Deep enough this time that he couldn't hide from it. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mom. But you let it happen." The sentence came out calm, almost gentle. That made it worse somehow. Grant opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again without speaking. Because there wasn't really a defense for silence, was there? Not when silence becomes permission. Camille leaned forward slightly. "This is unfair." Judith actually laughed at that. Short and humorless. "Unfair?" she repeated. "You started researching facilities less than a week after Lorraine bruised her shoulder." Camille's eyes sharpened immediately. "I was trying to be proactive." "No," Judith replied evenly. "You were trying to be prepared." Another silence. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows, while candlelight flickered softly across the dining room walls. The entire scene felt strangely surreal to me, like sitting inside someone else's family argument. Maybe because somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like my family at all. Sophie suddenly pushed her chair back from the table. "Grandma doesn't belong in assisted living." Camille turned instantly. "Sophie, enough." "No." Sophie's voice shook slightly now, but she kept going. "You keep talking about Grandma like she's not even here." Grant looked stunned. Camille looked irritated. And I felt my heart break a little watching my granddaughter become the only adult in the room willing to say the truth plainly. Camille's expression hardened for the first time all evening. Not dramatically, just enough for the mask to slip. "You don't understand the situation. I understand you keep trying to get rid of her." The words landed like shattered glass across the room. Grant stood immediately. "Sophie." But Sophie looked near tears now. "I heard you talking about the pool." Camille froze completely. A terrible stillness settled over the table. Grant slowly turned toward his wife. "What?" Camille recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "It was just a conversation. You said once Grandma moved out, we could finally renovate the backyard." Sophie's voice cracked slightly. "You already planned where the pool would go. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed for a second. Because children ruin lies in the most devastating ways imaginable. By repeating them honestly." Grant looked physically ill now. "Camille?" She straightened in her chair immediately, defensive this time. Cornered animals eventually stopped pretending to be gentle. "Oh, please," she snapped quietly. "Are we really going to act like discussing the future is some terrible crime?" There it was, the real voice underneath the careful concern. Sharp, frustrated, impatient. Judith leaned back slowly with the expression of someone finally seeing proof she already expected. Camille noticed too late that everyone at the table was looking at her differently now. Even Grant, especially Grant. I stood carefully from my chair, ignoring the dull ache still lingering in my shoulder. "I'm tired," I said softly. "I think I'll go upstairs." Grant immediately stepped forward. "Mom, wait." But I shook my head. No, I looked directly at my son one last time. Your father spent 40 years building this family. My voice remained calm despite the pressure tightening in my chest.
And somewhere along the way,
All of you started treating his home like a future transaction instead of a memory. Grant looked devastated. Camille looked angry. Sophie looked heartbroken. And Judith looked like she wanted to say something sharp enough to cut glass. But I was suddenly too exhausted to hear any more of it. I climbed the stairs, slowly, while voices started again quietly behind me downstairs. Grant and Camille arguing now. Sophie crying softly. Chairs moving against hardwood floors. The family finally cracking open under the weight of truths nobody wanted spoken aloud. Halfway up the staircase, I paused beside the hallway window. Overlooking the backyard, rain shimmered across the garden lights, while the rose bushes swayed gently in the wind. Franklin planted those roses the summer Grant graduated high school. Back when this family still felt safe, I rested my hand against the railing and closed my eyes briefly. Then, for the next morning, the house was quieter than I had ever heard it before. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after something breaks beyond repair. I woke early, just after sunrise, and lay still beneath the quilt, while pale morning light stretched across the bedroom walls. For a few seconds, I listened to the familiar sounds of the house breathing around me. Pipes settling, wind brushing softly against the windows. The old grandfather clock downstairs, marking time the same way it had for decades. Everything sounded the same, and yet nothing felt the same anymore. I dressed slowly and made my way downstairs, expecting tension. Another argument, another careful performance from Camille. Instead, I found Grant sitting alone at the kitchen table. He looked exhausted. Not the tiredness that comes from work or lack of sleep, something heavier than that. The kind of exhaustion people carry after finally seeing themselves clearly. A mug of untouched coffee sat in front of him. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded once and moved toward the coffee maker. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Grant cleared his throat. Camille took Sophie to school early. I simply nodded again. She stayed at her sister's last night after everything. The words hung awkwardly between us. After everything. As though betrayal were a storm that had simply passed through the house unexpectedly, instead of something slowly built over months. I poured coffee carefully into Franklin's old ceramic mug, the blue one with the chipped handle. Finally, Grant spoke again. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I closed my eyes briefly at that. Not because I was angry anymore, because the sentence was too small for the damage it carried. "You knew enough," I said softly. Grant looked down immediately. Shame again, deep and unavoidable now. I thought she was just worried. "No," I replied calmly. "You wanted to believe she was worried." That hurt him. I could see it. But sometimes the truth arrives late, because people spend too long protecting themselves from it. Grant rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "Howard called me this morning." That surprised me enough to finally look at him directly. "He did?" Grant nodded. He explained the trust. The house. Everything Dad set up before he died. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Grant whispered something that nearly broke my heart. Dad knew. I sat down across from him quietly. "Yes," I said. "I think he did." The kitchen fell silent again. Outside, sunlight touched the backyard roses Franklin planted years ago. Tiny drops of rain still clung to the petals from last night's storm. Grant stared toward the garden with red-rimmed eyes. I failed him. The honesties in his voice startled me. Not defensive, not rehearsed, just broken. And suddenly, looking at my son, sitting there at 50 years old with grief and shame carved across his face, I remembered the little boy who used to run into my bedroom after nightmares. The teenager who cried when Franklin left for business trips. The young man who once promised he'd always protect family first. People don't become strangers all at once. Sometimes they become weak first, then selfish, then silent long enough to lose themselves completely. "I'm sorry, Mom," Grant whispered. And this time, I believed him. Not because apologies erase betrayal. They don't. But because for the first time in months, his voice sounded like my son's again. A few hours later, Camille returned home. The confidence she once carried through the house had disappeared completely. No polished speeches. No soft manipulation disguised as concern. She looked tired, smaller somehow. Howard had apparently contacted her attorney directly that morning regarding the trust and the legal protections. Franklin established before his death. The house could not be sold, transferred, or leveraged without my consent. And any attempt to challenge my competency without legitimate medical evidence would fail immediately. Franklin had protected me more carefully than I ever realized. Camille stood awkwardly near the front hallway, while I folded laundry in the living room. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "I never meant for things go this far." I folded one of Franklin's old sweaters slowly before answering. "That's the strange thing about selfishness," I said softly. "People rarely notice how far they've gone until someone stops cooperating." She lowered her eyes after that. And for the first time since all of this began, Camille looked less like a villain and more like a woman trapped inside her own hunger for control. Sophie came home from school shortly afterward and hugged me so tightly I nearly cried. "I'm glad you're staying," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head gently. "So am I." That evening, after everyone went upstairs, I carried a blanket onto the back porch and sat alone beneath the soft glow of the garden lights. The air smelled like wet earth and roses. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes moved quietly in the dark. I thought about Franklin, about trust, about aging, about how quickly some people begin treating older women like temporary guests in lives they spent decades building. But I also thought about something else, survival. Because despite everything, I was still here, still in my home, still myself. They thought one small fall had made me fragile. What they failed to understand was this: a woman who survives grief, motherhood, disappointment, loneliness, and time itself does not become weak so easily. Sometimes she simply becomes quieter. And quieter women are often the ones people underestimate most. Growing older taught me something I wish I had understood sooner. Not everyone who speaks softly has good intentions. Sometimes control arrives disguised as concern, and silence from the people we love can wound us more deeply than cruelty from strangers. But I also learned that dignity does not disappear with age, and neither does strength. As long as I still knew who I was, no one could quietly erase me from the life Franklin and I built together.